It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10, our top story. The White House says Donald Trump could meet Vladimir Putin as early as next week for talks on a ceasefire in Ukraine. It comes after Trump's top negotiator met the Russian president for what's been described as constructive talks. Also tonight, Israel's Prime Minister prepares to push his cabinet for an all-out occupation of Gaza as more stories of death and desperation emerge from there. The safeguarding minister condemns idiot councils who don't think they have a grooming problem as AI is rolled out in the hunt for criminals. Taxing times for the Chancellor as an influential think tank warns she needs to tackle an economic black hole of more than £40 billion. A private spat played out in public. Prince Harry hits back at allegations of harassment made during an interview on Sky News. Hiroshima remembers. Symbolism and reflection marks the 80th anniversary of the atomic bombing. And later we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages. That's in our press preview from 10:30 right through to midnight. Hello there, good evening. During his presidential campaign, Donald Trump repeatedly claimed he could end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours of taking office. He changed that tone when he returned to the White House, but his push for peace is gathering pace again, with talk tonight of a face-to-face meeting with Vladimir Putin, possibly as soon as next week. Earlier, the US Special Envoy, Steve Witkoff, held 3 hours of talks with Mr. Putin in Moscow, which Donald Trump described as highly productive. The US president is said to have raised the prospect of a meeting with his Russian counterpart during a phone call with Ukraine's president and other European leaders this evening. But it's said to be conditional on Vladimir Putin agreeing to meet Volodymyr Zelensky. Well, we are expecting to hear from Donald Trump in the Oval Office shortly. But first, let's bring in our US correspondent, David Blevins, who's at the White House. And a day of real contradictions, David, but culminating in the potential prospect of a three-way meeting on Ukraine.
That's right. Here in Washington and in Moscow, there was no expectation whatsoever of any breakthrough. This day began with Donald Trump accusing Russia of posing a threat to America's national security and imposing sanctions on India for buying Russian oil. Then came a second statement from the president, reporting that his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, had made what he described as great progress in a meeting with the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. And this evening, the New York Times is reporting that President Trump could meet with President Putin as early as next week. In response to that report, his press secretary, Caroline Levitt, says the Russians expressed a desire to meet with President Trump, and he's open to that. Another White House official has told our colleagues at NBC that the meeting could indeed take place next week if Putin also agrees to meet with President Zelensky. That is a huge question. Now, where would the meeting take place? We understand they are exploring options. When exactly? In theory, next week, but they are conceding that the timing could slide. But if there is even the potential for a face-to-face meeting between Presidents Trump in the coming days, then something has significantly shifted. And President Zelensky says it's because the pressure from sanctions is working that the Kremlin is now more inclined towards a ceasefire. Donald Trump repeatedly vowed during the election campaign that he would end this war in 24 hours. On day 198 of his presidency, he may be one step closer to doing that.
Well, we've heard from the US Secretary of State speaking to One US Network 2, Marco Rubio, suggesting he does not know if that meeting would take place as early as next week. Depends how much progress is made. And of course, this deadline is looming. The prospect is there of more sanctions on Russia and secondary sanctions too, as we saw on India suggested today.
Yes, the president imposing sanctions of 25% tariffs on India for purchasing Russian oil. That brings the total tariff that India faces to 50%. Now, some people might find it rather strange that Donald Trump is criticising Russia in one hand, but also suggesting that his special envoy made great progress on the other hand. That does seem contradictory, but I think it's important to remember that the deadline for sanctions against Russia, or more sanctions, is still in play. Donald Trump is, I suppose, politically bound to the date he has set, and that's Friday. And it's also important to remember that even if Steve Witkoff made great progress in the talks today, he didn't emerge from the Kremlin with a ceasefire, and that's what America demands. So it would appear that Donald Trump is attempting to establish or maintain a peace process while at the same time attempting to assert dominance, to hold sway over Vladimir Putin. But certainly it feels like something has changed this evening.
David Blevins, do stay there for us. Obviously, we are waiting to hear from Donald Trump in the Oval Office, alongside actually the boss of Apple, Tim Cook. It's about $100 billion of Apple investment back into America. But no doubt there'll be plenty of questions about the prospect of a meeting, further sanctions and those tariffs on India, as we've discussed. So do stay tuned for that. Well, as we've mentioned then, Donald Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, travelled to Moscow for a 3-hour meeting with Vladimir Putin. Here's our Moscow correspondent, Ivor Bennett.
He didn't look like someone who was here to read the riot act. In sunglasses and in no obvious rush, Steve Witkoff's first stop was a walk in the park. His relaxed appearance in stark contrast to the recent rhetoric from the White House. It's given Vladimir Putin until Friday to end the war or face sanctions. But all we saw Witkoff receive was a warm welcome ahead of 3 hours of talks.
A very useful and constructive conversation took place. If we name the topics, then first of all it is the Ukrainian crisis, and the second topic is the prospects for the possible development of strategic partnership between the Russian Federation and the United States.
But that partnership has come under strain in the face of continued Russian attacks on Ukraine.
Russia, I think it's disgusting what they're doing. I think it's disgusting.
From Donald Trump, there's frustration, but from Moscow, little outward concern. It's not just Donald Trump's stance towards Russia that seems to have shifted in recent weeks. It's also Russia's stance towards him. The Kremlin now seems much less concerned than it used to be about upsetting him, and much less willing to comply with his push for peace. One Russian newspaper today even compared him to a drum and described him as loud and empty. That's because Russian forces are still advancing, and a military victory may be all that matters.
In Russia, end of the war without visible victory, it's a very sensitive and maybe painful issue. Russia needs visible victory, and that's why for Putin, chances to say, okay, I am ready to stop, are nearly zero.
And you'll find many in Moscow who are happy with that.
I'm worried, but I think our government is doing everything and have faith in them.
I support Putin's policy, and I want everything to be how we want it to be, not how the Americans want it to be.
Despite US pressure, Russia's course seems set, and only one man can change it. Ivor Bennett, Sky News, Moscow.
Well, the camera's moving around, but as you can see, there is the live scene now inside the Oval Office. After that meeting, actually, between Witkoff and Putin, we know that Donald Trump picked up the phone to Volodymyr Zelensky alongside a number of European leaders. Apologies, this camera's moving around rather a lot, including, we understand, Sir Keir Starmer, the German Chancellor, the NATO Secretary General as well on that meeting. But in terms of ending the war, Marco Rubio, in this interview he's given to a US network, suggests that we have a better understanding of the conditions under which Russia would end the war. Key element of ending the war will be territorial, which is something that we've all understood, I suppose. Marco Rubio suggesting also that Mr. Trump could talk to President Putin over the next couple of days. As we mentioned, Trump set a deadline of this Friday for a ceasefire. Big moment here, as you can see, Apple American manufacturing program. He's got his cabinet again alongside him. This is Tim Cook, Apple CEO, presenting another $100 billion of Apple investment into America, taking the total to $600 billion over the next 4 years. We know that Apple has manufactured a lot of its iPhone capability in China, and in fact, it's moved some of it out of China to India and Vietnam. And in fact, only a couple of days ago, Tim Cook suggesting that most US phones sold in America are actually produced now in India. India, which today received the prospect of an extra 25% tariffs as an importer of Russian oil, taking its tariffs to 50%. So what Tim Cook has to say about that today will be very interesting. But as you can see, the press gathered for this announcement by Apple. The questions, though, will be about what happens with Russia, the prospects of that meeting, whether anybody would include Volodymyr Zelensky, whether Putin would ever agree to that prospect, and also what happened in that meeting with Steve Witkoff and President Putin. What are the elements that Russia would agree to end the war, with, as I said, that deadline looming this Friday. So we will move on at the moment, but we will certainly take you straight back there as soon as we see President Trump sat behind the Oval Office desk, it looks like. Well, from the conflict then in Ukraine to another war, this one in Gaza, where officials say at least 20 people were killed when an aid truck overturned after being overwhelmed by crowds seeking food. The Palestinian Red Crescent says its headquarters in the Strip have once again been struck by the Israeli military. Well, tomorrow, Benjamin Netanyahu is set to convene a meeting of his security cabinet to discuss an all-out occupation of Gaza. Our international correspondent, Diana Magnay, reports now from Jerusalem.
If it's not bombs, it is the constant blaring of horns, the endless sound of emergency as the injured are brought in to the doors of the Nasser hospital in southern Gaza. Young boys and men who just a few hours earlier were pushing and jostling to get food from aid trucks in the Morag corridor. And now they're treated for gunshot wounds mostly, where there's space on the floor with pools of blood around them. Bullets plucked from flesh. Who was shooting, we don't know, but there are a lot of injuries. This next bit of footage from the Nasser hospital we've decided that we cannot air because it is too graphic, but basically it shows a young man.
To the Oval Office and Mr. Trump.
Legends of our time, my book.